Well, good day, everyone. My name is Kerry Potter. I'm the BMP coordinator for the Alabama Forestry Commission, and I am coming to you from our state office in Montgomery, where I'm recording this PowerPoint presentation on Alabama BMPs, more especially our working forests, wildlife, and sustainability. This is for your PLM training course, and I will be going into talking more in depth about water quality, streams, types of streams, and your basic BMPs in general. So let's talk about the importance of water, because it's very important for our existence, on an everyday basis. Over 50% of the drinking water in the U.S. comes from forested watersheds. That's a lot of different streams, creeks, and rivers flowing through our state. More approximately, this number is going to be 132,419 miles of creeks, streams, and rivers. This figure was increased from 77,000. And just think about, there's more freshwater biodiversity in the state of Alabama than any other state. There are certain aquatic species that are only found in Alabama. When you consider this, think of several of the Midwestern states which don't even compare with Alabama. You could take 5 or 6 different Midwest states, and they do not come close to the many species or the biodiversity that's found within the state of Alabama. So what are BMPs? BMPs are best management practices, and Alabama follows the BMPs for forestry, which are non-regulatory guidelines, which means these are not mandatory guidelines, but they are followed to protect water quality within the state. There are 15 federally mandated BMPs that are regulated, and these concern the federal wetlands that exist in Alabama and what you can do as far as your best management practices within these wetland areas. The Alabama BMPs were suggested to help Alabama's forestry community maintain and protect the physical, chemical, and biological integrity of waters of the state as required by federal and state laws. These federal and state laws that we're talking about encompass the Federal Water Pollution Act, the Clean Water Act, the Water Quality Act, and the Coastal Zone Management Act. Within Alabama, we have our Alabama Water Pollution Control Act. These are all acts that are very influential in keeping the waters of our state clean and not polluted. So BMPs are no longer voluntary. They're suggested that you follow to protect our water quality within the state. But there are certain member companies that must follow BMP standards by written contract with dealer and supplier. These are mainly your pulp mills in Alabama that are under the SFI or FSC or PEFC standard. SFI stands for Sustainable Forestry Initiative. What this means to you as a logger and landowner is that these mills are constantly checking the tracks that are cut on your properties or the properties that you cut to make sure that BMPs are being followed when you're harvesting timber. If you're not maintaining the BMPs or are in compliance with the state BMPs, these mills can choose to not take wood from you, and that could really affect you as a company. If we have any unresolved BMP complaints, these are reported to the SIC, which is the Sustainability Implementation Committee and member companies, and consequences can be severe. SIC committee has mill representatives that reside on the committee, and so they know about any of the complaints that happen, especially if there are severe complaints that are unresolved. There have been 2 unsuccessful court cases attempted to require a permit for all forest roads as point services. Right now, all forestry, silvicultural, logging activities related around logging are non-point sources. So you may ask, what's the difference between a point source and a non-point source? A point source is something that, hey, you can point your finger at and say, hey, that is the definite reason that pollution is entering a stream. Now, with logging and practices and best management practices of the state, we have several different guidelines we use for roads, loading decks, logging sites, streams, SMZs that protect the water quality and make sure that, you know, any source of pollution will be a non-point source, which if you're following your BMPs and you're doing everything that you're supposed to be doing, you don't have any problems with any pollution source getting into the stream. The EPA recently ruled that permitting of all forest roads was not necessary because of success in BMPs in protecting water quality. This is why BMP implementation is so important. So we do not get the federal government involved with our state affairs with logging practices and start, you know, implementing federal laws that apply to, you know, how you cut your timber, because we already have BMPs in place that do that. So that's why following BMPs is so important, you know, with all your forest harvesting activities. ADM states that BMPs must be maintained until the site is fully revegetated. That means all of your BMP work on roads, whether it's water bars, turnouts, your grading of the roads, your skid trail, water retention devices, your SMZ zones, streamside management zones. If you have a perennial stream, do you have the right buffer, you know, on either side of the stream bank, which should be 35 feet. All these different BMPs must be maintained until the track is able to green up and be fully vegetated. So let's talk about the Endangered Species Act and BMPs. Endangered species, there's certain lawsuits against the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that continue to exist. At this point, there are over 250 imperiled species that reside in the rivers, streams, creeks in Alabama. 13 of these are aquatic, which are your fish, mussels, crayfish, and snails. BMPs, especially SMZs, your streamside management zones, are the key to avoid regulation in SHUs. Those are your strategic habitat units. Like I said earlier, following BMP ensures that, you know, you're protecting these imperiled and endangered species that exist within the state. If you're doing everything you should do with your SMZs, your streamside management zones, protecting your streams, then you shouldn't have any problems, you know, endangering any of these species. The Trump administration has also pledged to revise the listing process. So in the future, you might see more and more species added to this list. And so that's why it's so important to follow BMPs so you don't have any regulatory issues with the U.S. Fisheries and Wildlife Service. Because if you go in and you start threatening these streams by, you know, making your SMZs smaller where they should be wider and causing problems with these endangered species or imperiled species, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service can come in and issue some pretty significant fines, which are really going to hurt. And these threatened and endangered species and the water quality concerns are not going away. These concerns and issues are going to get worse and worse as time goes by, unless these BMPs are adequately followed. So what are some of your pollutants? Well, some of your silvicultural non-point source pollutants would be sediment, organic materials, temperature, trash, pesticides, and nutrients. These are some of the main pollutant sources that can get in your streams. Temperature is more of a water quality or water temperature issue, where if you cut too many trees along a major stream or creek, it's going to change the temperature of that stream, and it can endanger some of the aquatic species that live there. Trash, that would be just trash from logging operations. Hydraulic buckets, you want to keep those in a container and off the property, and away from these streams where they can, and upland sites where they can get into the streams. Nutrient flow, that's some of your fertilizers. All of these contribute, to polluting the waters of the state. We want to make sure that we keep these out of the streams and creeks and rivers, and away from causing any source of pollution. So BMP standards in Alabama, our Alabama's best management practices for forestry involve several different core areas. These are your streamside management zones, or SMZs. These are the buffers on either side of a perennial stream bank. Your stream crossings, your forest roads, timber harvesting, reforestation, stand management, forested wetland management, where you have federal wetlands where they exist, and then revegetation and stabilization. This is some of your remediation work in case you have any BMP issues or problems. Remember, always think and plan before you act. Always have a plan in place before you start your logging operation. A good idea is to have a pre-harvest plan in place to where you know where all of your loading decks should be, where your roads should be. If there's a stream that exists on the property, and it's a perennial stream, intermittent stream, or ephemeral, which we'll get into later on, make sure that these are properly marked, before you start your timber harvest. So always think and plan before you act. So what is a streamside management zone? This is a strip of land immediately adjacent to the waters of the state where soils, organic material, matter, and vegetation are managed to prevent pollutants from forestry operations. This is kind of your buffer that keeps all of these materials out of your stream. This is required for perennial. The SMZ is required for perennial, and that's a 35-foot buffer on perennial streams per side, so 70 feet total. And this is recommended for intermittent streams as well. So what is a stream? A stream consists of a bed, a bank, and a high water mark. Your bed is where the water flows through, and your banks contain the water. It's always recommended that a consultant forester or registered forester mark or flag the SMZs before harvest. I always suggest this with a lot of tracks that I do inspections on. Is the SMZ marked? Have they made an effort to go in and paint or mark the lines with flagging where the SMZ exists? It's always a good idea to have this policy in place before you start harvesting a tract. And you also need to keep your roads and logging decks outside the SMZs. Another main point I'll expand on is do not skid parallel with your SMZs. Try to come in at perpendicular angles to your SMZs where you have to harvest timber. And whatever you do, do not skid right down the bank of an SMZ. I've seen this a lot in the past, and it's sort of becoming a problem that I found with a lot of tracks that I look at. So here's an aerial photo of an SMZ. In the middle of the photo, you can see the perennial stream. This is a main creek or stream that goes through that property. And these little feeders off of it are either intermittent or ephemeral streams that tie into that main stream. And it's always good to protect those ephemeral and intermittent areas too, because any source of pollution that can get into those streams, these little feeder streams, are going to go straight to your major perennial stream and cause pollution problems down the road. So let's talk a little bit more about perennial streams and SMZs. Perennial streams flow year-round under normal weather conditions. They'll have a definite bed, a bank, and a high water mark. These are usually specified or found on as a solid blue line on a topo or USGS quad map. You should leave a 35-foot minimum SMZ width on either side of the bank. And when I state or emphasize minimum, if you have a lot of slope involved with the stream, the SMZ, you should probably allow for a little bit wider SMZ, especially where slope is involved. This SMZ width can be increased with the landowner objectives, on-site conditions, and stream sensitivity. Excuse me. You also need to take into consideration soil erodibility, soil equipment limitations, slope, like I've talked about, and topography. Another thing to consider is where these streams may exit. If you have a major stream going into a major tributary or a waterway, such as a river, it might be a good idea to leave a wider SMZ just to ensure that you don't have any chance of any sediment or pollution getting into the stream and going straight to the river. Within these perennial streams, you should leave 50%. You can leave a 50% crown cover and harvest timber within these buffer areas. Just remember that you need to selectively mark the trees out of these buffer areas and make sure that 50% of the crown cover is left. Also, it's important to take out all of any residual logging debris that may have found its way into the water of the stream. So whatever goes in the water must come out. This is a photo of an SMZ that has been selectively harvested. You can see in the photo that where the stream bed and the bank is, none of the trees have been cut along the edge of the bank, and you have trees. You have a good vegetative layer and a good crown closure left within that buffer zone. This is an incorrect SMZ that was left on a perennial stream. On the far left side of the slide, you can see the stream bed, the bank, and then actually a tree right in the middle of the slide that was cut right there close to the edge of the bank. The big difference in this picture between the last, you see that 50% crown closure was not left. That tree that was cut in the middle probably should have been left, or definitely should have been left, excuse me. And you should have marked your buffer to where you leave these trees and you know where your buffer zone is. I see this a lot with a lot of the complaints that I have within the state. So number one, always mark your perennial SMZ buffers. Number two, it's a good idea to go in. If you're going to selectively remove trees within that buffer, just go ahead and mark those trees, either paint them or flag them, so you can get an idea of what's going to come out of that SMZ buffer. It's another picture of an incorrect SMZ buffer that was left. You can see that 50% of the crown closure was not left within this buffer. They left a few trees, but this is going to cause problems with sediment getting into the stream. It's going to cause temperature problems, which I talked about earlier, that can change the temperature of that stream and endanger any of the aquatic species that are living there. So you run into risk of having really big problems, not only with water quality, but also with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, coming to you and saying, hey, you've just put another species on the extinction list. We have some fines that we want to deal out to you. So what are you going to accomplish from cutting a few trees within that SMZ, or cutting most of those out? What is that? Maybe a quarter of a load per acre, or every 5 acres. So it's a good idea just to leave these buffers intact at all possible. So we've talked about perennial streams. Let's talk about intermittent streams. Intermittent streams flow part of the year, and they'll have a bank and a bed, but may not have a high water mark. These show up as a dashed blue line on your topo map or USGS quad, and they may or may not show up. A lot of these maps are kind of outdated, and you don't see some of these that exist. You can have a partial cut or regeneration cut with these intermittent streams if the water quality for the stream is protected. That means you can actually cut the timber on either side of these intermittent streams, but you must protect that buffer area and make sure there's a vegetative layer that's left. We've got to have this vegetative ground cover and organic debris to protect the forest floor and to keep that buffer that exists to keep any sediment from flowing into the stream. If there's no canopy cover that is left, make sure that your vegetative ground cover is left. And if you do cut within these intermittent streams and you remove soil or you disrupt soil, make sure this is fixed before you leave these areas. You have to put in some hay bales, spread some hay, some grass seed, put in some silt fencing. Just make sure that sediment cannot get into this stream in any way. Here are some examples of incorrect SMZs that were left. A lot of these are dealing with perennial type streams. The top left, you can see that some sediment and some debris was left within that stream bed. Same thing on the middle slide, plus you can see where they've disrupted that vegetative layer, that buffer right next to the stream, and by running a skidder right next to it, and this opens up the possibility of sediment getting into the stream. You can actually see in that middle slide, on the bottom part of the slide, where sediment is actually getting into the stream and causing it to be silted in or turbid. On the bottom right, that's another example of an intermittent where they're leaving debris within the stream that's going to have to come out. That water's got to be able to flow to move the water off that property. And it's got to be in a state where you don't have sediment getting into that intermittent stream. So ephemeral streams are our last type of stream that we'll talk about. Ephemeral streams are your shallow ditches or depressions. They're usually dry most of the year. Usually the only time you see these are within wet areas or flooding type areas, and these transport the water, off the track, into probably an intermittent or perennial stream. They may or may not have a defined bed or bank, and will not have a high water mark. These are usually not identified on a topo, but you can observe the contour lines on the topo maps and see where these ditches and cuts are, by your V-shaped lines on the topo map. These ephemeral streams do not require an SMZ or canopy cover. You do still need to use keep a vegetative cover or litter layer, as a buffer on either side of the stream bed. Remove any debris material within these ephemeral streams that could dam up and cause the water to stop flowing. And another thing to consider is these streams can cause severe water quality issues if the banks are beaten down to bare mineral soil. What we're talking about there is, these streams are transport vessels. These ephemerals are transport vessels that lead to intermittent and perennial streams. So any sedimentation movement that is carried by these ephemeral streams can still reach these intermittent and perennial streams and cause problems if not managed properly. Here we have a slide of an ephemeral stream with no SMZ. As you can see in the slide, there's still a lot of debris left within this ephemeral. As you see, there's the slope changes on either side of this ephemeral, and a lot of this debris was left in here, and you can see some movement of sedimentation in the middle of that slide. Here's some more examples where top left, you left a lot of logging tops and debris within the ephemeral, and a lot of times you're going to stop these up and cause problems with water flow. This should be pulled out, and these buffers along these ephemerals protected. Try to make sure that you leave a good buffer area, and it's always a good idea to leave a stringer of trees on either side, just to make sure you have adequate protection for these ephemeral streams. Like I said earlier, these ephemeral intermittent streams, they're going to flow to a major water source, most of the time. They're going to go to a river, they're going to go to a tributary. That a lot of times these are feeding into ponds. So any sediment movement you have coming from a track that you're cutting is going off of that track onto your neighbor's, and this can be a major problem in silting in your neighbor's pond, and the next thing you know, you have a lawsuit because he stocked his pond with Florida trophy bass and bluegill, and you've killed all his fish within that pond. Well, now he's got an issue with it, and a lot of times they're going to hire attorneys and they're going to pursue it. I see a lot of complaints each year where the same thing happens. Inadequate BMPs weren't being followed as far as streams and SMZs, especially SMZ width, and this is what happened. Your neighbor, a quarter mile, half mile downstream, had their pond silted in. So it's always a good idea to keep this under consideration in your planning stages before you cut the track. Look at what's downstream from some of the SMZs that you're going to have, some of the major streams that go through the track that you're cutting. Do they end up in someone's pond? Do they go to a major tributary or river where they could cause problems? In these instances, it's probably a good idea to leave a little bit wider SMZ than you normally would, just to make sure that you don't cause any of these problems down the road. Like I just discussed, avoid these disturbances where these drain areas join intermittent perennial streams. We've seen what kind of problems they will cause. ADM, or Alabama Department of Environmental Management, will consider old ag canals, ditches as streams if they have been on the landscape long enough to develop a distinct bed and bank. Another telltale sign is if the ag canal or ditch has aquatic, fish species, snails, all those different critters and vegetation within it. Usually your fresh cut canals will not have these. It's always a good idea to protect the vegetative layer on these regardless. But if you have an old ag ditch that's been there for a long time and you noticed minnows and aquatic species within it, it's probably a good idea to leave a good buffer, or a good tree buffer along these ditches. These are certain slides of ag ditches that were ephemeral streams. I don't know if you can see the top left slide. This ephemeral stream is all clogged up. There's actually an old bridge that goes across it. You can see the tops that are in it right there. That bottom left, that one actually had some minnow species in it, aquatic species. And the middle right, that's an old bridge going across another old ag ditch that ended up being an ephemeral stream, and it was pretty clogged up on either side. So always plan and plan for these situations where you know where all your streams are, whether they're perennial, intermittent, or ephemeral, and have a logging plan adjusted to that. All right, stream crossings. Everybody has them at some point in time. The best thing is to avoid them if possible. If you're cutting a 40-acre block and there's a SMZ right through the middle, a major stream right through the middle of that 40 acres, and you can access it on either side of that stream, it's a good idea to do so. Just to make sure you don't cause any problems by crossing the stream. So if you find where you can't access, each side of the SMZ in some way or another, it's a good idea to try to go ahead and do that. Try to locate these stream crossings where the bank and the SMZ will be least disturbed if you actually do have to put in a crossing. So you must allow for the normal passage of water and these aquatic species to make their way up and down the stream. So what I'm saying here is do not pile in a lot of dirt / logging debris into these streams to where you dam up the stream until you're done logging. Make sure that water can flow while you are pulling wood back and forth across an SMZ. So some of these stream crossings that we do are log crossings, fords or low water crossings, culverts that we put in, bridges. Bridges are probably your least intrusive form of crossing. They can be a little costly sometimes, but they actually pay for themselves in the end instead of having to come back and do extra work pulling out crossings. You can pull these bridges out as you go, or these ramps that some people use, and you haven't affected the stream banks as much. You haven't put any debris into the streams. And that's the biggest thing I'm talking about here, is not putting any more debris into the streams than you have to, and make sure all of that is pulled out. Of course, any temporary crossing must be removed. And when I say it must be removed, it should be completely pulled out and the stream bank stabilized on either side. If there's a slope involved going down to these crossings, you may need to put in some water bars, some turnouts, put in a lot of extra slash. You may even have to put in some silt fencing, just depending on what topography of that track suggests. But definitely all these permanent and temporary crossings must be stabilized. Some of the material you can use for stream crossings, log crossings is probably one of your easiest things to do. Just take your hollow or solid logs and put into the channel, and then come over the top of it with some type of skid bridge or mat, if at all possible. But whatever you do, do not use limbs, brush, or dirt. And remember, with any of these crossings, what goes in must come out. Excuse me. This is a slide of one of your well-implemented crossings. These are logs that were put in, linearly or lengthwise across the stream. A lot of times you see them just put in parallel within the stream bed, and then a mat put over the logs to cross. The biggest thing is not to impede the water flow, so that aquatic species on either side of that crossing can't go back and forth. This is an example of a poor crossing. This is just logging slash debris, dirt that's put in, and it has dammed up this stream. And this will be a major pain to remove, and this is going to cost you extra time and money to make sure all this debris is pulled out of the stream bed, and each individual approach on either side of the stream is stabilized. Here's another example of a poor crossing. This is one from North Alabama. This is just a lot of sticks, tops, log and slash that was put in to cross over. This would probably been a good example of when to use a bridge or a culvert that you can put in and pull out. This is another example of a poor crossing. Fords can be used when the creek bed is firm. A lot of people use these when there's a lot of rock that exists, on streams, really rocky bottom streams. It's a good idea to use these where the banks are low. You don't have any steep incline coming up to the stream banks. Where these are used, the banks should be backbladed away from the channel and used to improve the approaches. That means using these to divert a lot of any sedimentation that can make its way into these crossings to keep it away from there. You always use rock to stabilize the stream bed. You can use a good policy or procedure to use is have your riprap put in and with some smaller rock on top where the water can flow through naturally. Here's a good slide example of a well-implemented ford. So there wasn't a whole lot of water in this creek anyway, but it's able to flow across the bottom of this ford. It's not impeded in any way. So that's a good example of a ford to use. You got lots of rock there. Shouldn't have a problem with sediment getting into the stream. Culverts should be used to reduce the potential for road washouts and impoundments of water. Culverts usually best to use in permanent crossing type situations, or I know a lot of loggers carry around the metal or plastic culverts where they can put in intermittent or perennial crossings where needed, and then they can just pull them out when they come out. If you look in our BMP manuals, you'll see the minimum size culvert that's recommended in each individual use, and a lot of that's determined by the amount of watershed flow in it per area. One good idea, or one great idea to use when using culverts is put in one bigger size than is recommended when you're using the culverts. You probably want to have one that has a larger diameter compared to one that's smaller, just to make sure that the water flow is being allowed where these crossings exist. These culverts, when they're put in, should extend a minimum of 1 foot beyond the fill. The fill material should be stabilized with sandbags, rock, or vegetation. One of the things I see the most is using rock, with these crossings. It's a good idea to stabilize or seat these culvert crossings with rock. Sandbags can be used. I've seen hay bales that are staked out and used. Just make sure you don't get any of the sediment, from the crossing into the stream. Here's an example of a couple of permanent crossings that culverts that were put in extremely well. And you see they're extending a foot or more, past the fill. The fill is usually rock around the facings of those culverts. That's keeping a lot of sediment from getting into the stream. Then you have a good base over it. You don't want to put your fill over the top of the crossing, the culvert, and have it less than a foot. You want at least a foot or more of fill over the top of that culvert when you put it in. Just make sure, number one, you don't crush your culvert when you go over it, and you have a good pad where your traffic or your log trucks can get over and not have to worry about causing any problems or any cave-ins, with that culvert installation. And this is several examples of culverts that have failed. The one on the top left, it was not packed in good. It wasn't stabilized very well. All they used was loose fill around this culvert, and your first major rain, this is what happens. It's going to wash out a lot of that fill, and it's going to get into that stream, and you're going to have some major pollution problems, sedimentation problems. On the bottom right is a culvert that you didn't have adequate fill on top of the culvert, and it was crushed. So what I was talking about earlier, make sure they're stabilized good. Use proper stabilizing agent, whether it's rock, sandbags, whatever. But do not just use loose soil to pack it in. And make sure your cover on that culvert over the top of it is at least a foot or more deep. Bridges are probably your easiest crossing to use. One of the best that, in my opinion, to use because they create the least amount of disruption of stream flow. You still have to stabilize your banks and fill material to prevent erosion with these when they're put in and taken out. But you don't have to go through all the effort of packing in a culvert or putting in several logs for a log crossing. These can be just put in in one move, and then when you're done, pull them out, stabilize your bank areas, and you're gone. I mean, everything's taken care of. One thing to remember on these, the spans must be installed to permit passage of expected high water flow. Make sure that they come far enough across the stream bank to where in case the water comes up that you don't have to worry about these bridges floating off. Here's an example of a portable bridge. As you see in this slide, they extend pretty good ways on either side of the stream bank. This is a pretty heavy-duty bridge. I don't think you'll have any problems out of that. And you're not really disrupting a whole lot of the buffer area, the vegetative area that exists on either side of that crossing. So, and these last a long time. So if at all possible, get a portable bridge that you can take around from job site to job site. I promise you it will pay for itself, with the work and effort that you would have to do with some of these other crossings. It would definitely pay for itself in the future. All right, let's talk about forest roads now. As with any of your BMPs, proper planning and location should be used to minimize the potential for pollutants, coming off of these forest roads. With adequate drainage is the most important factor to consider, when you put these forest roads in. It's a matter of getting, making sure the sedimentation is not taken from these roads and can go into a stream. So several of the different ways to build these roads, maintain adequate drainage is crowning your roads. Everybody's heard of crowned and ditched roads. Water's able to flow off the top of these roads and stay in ditches and then go down into turnouts, which can be put into, any sediment flow can be put within a vegetative area that way. You have outslope roads, which slope away into, an area of vegetative area. Inslope roads, which usually, have a ditch and turnouts involved with that. Broad base dips, these are your, smaller water bars with the dips to channel water off the road into vegetative areas. One of the things you see most often is water bars with turnouts. You consider with water bars is putting these in at a proper angle, like a 45 or 50 degree angle, and the right height to make sure that water is adequately diverted off the roads into areas of vegetative cover. Another real important fact to think about on water bars is packing these water bars in, just so when it rains it doesn't wash your water bar out. And one of the main things is just controlling non-essential traffic. This may require putting up a cable gate or a steel gate, just keeping unwanted traffic off those roads so you can maintain the integrity of your roads. You don't want to spend a whole lot of money doing all this road work and make sure you have these great roads and then have Joe Blow come in and mud ride all over your property and destroy all the work that you've done. And believe me, I've seen this where it's happened. So try to control the traffic on and off these roads, whether it's using a cable or a gate, some way to keep people out. It's a good idea to always put rock at the entrance on your logging site. That's to keep a lot of mud off the road. I know I get calls all the time, hey, this guy's got a major problem over here. He's pulling all this mud out on the road. And that happens in a lot of different logging sites. It's a good idea to rock, these entrances to where you can clean your tires off before you get out onto the road. I know in Georgia in the past, when I was doing some logging jobs, DOT required that you put in rock at every entrance where logging trucks were going to come out. And this had to be 150, 200 feet of rock, to clean the tires off before you came out on the main road. So it's always a good thing to consider, when you have one of these logging jobs and you're coming out into a main road. Make sure you rock it really good. Here's an example of a in-service forest road that was put in. So you probably, when you're done with this, you need to come back and crown this road and ditch it a little bit and put in water bars where you can divert the water off this road, into the stand, into just different vegetative areas within the stand. Here's an example of a crown and ditched road. Water's able to run off these roads very easily. Keeps them from rutting up a lot. So that water's moving off the top of that road into the ditches and going away from the road into that vegetative layer. So crowned and ditched roads are a good way to keep that water off of roads. Here's a very steep forest road that was put in. You can see there were pretty major water bars, turnouts that was put in. And the steeper the slope on these roads, the more water bars you're going to have to put in. If you look in our BMP manual, you'll see just how many per feet in between water bars you'll have to use, depending upon slope. So you can see where there would be the potential for BMP problems or sedimentation problems on this road, because usually at the bottom there's going to be a stream or a major waterway that exists. You want to keep that sediment out out of that stream. Here's a road where they use mats for stabilizing the road. A lot of people use these coming in and out of tracks to keep mud off the main road, but it also helps protect that road while you're there logging. And these are easy to remove once you're finished and pack up and move on. You just pull those up and take them with you. And here we're going to get into some slides involving forest road problems. And you see in this slide, you have some major rutting on this road crossing an SMZS stream, no doubt. All that sediment is going to flow down that road into that stream, and you're going to have some major problems. Another example of a steep road or skid trail going down into an SMZ. As you can see in this skid trail, there weren't any water diversion devices put in, no turnouts, no slash put in. So all that loose soil sediment is going to be able to go straight down the hill into that stream. A lot of times brush piles are not good substitutes for water bars or turnouts, especially if there's a lot of slope involved in the approaches going to these SMZ streamside crossings. It's better to use where you have a lot of topography, a lot of slope, to use silt fencing, using a lot of larger water bars, on these for water diversion devices. And where you have your turnouts, have hay bales and silt fencing to turn that water out into a hay bale to where it doesn't make its way down into the stream. Like I say, putting a pile or two isn't going to help slow that movement of sediment down into a stream. This would have been a better situation in this slide to use a couple of big water bars going up there and turning that water into that vegetative layer on either side. And this is what happens when you don't put in these water diversion devices. That once you have a good rainfall, all this loose soil or sediment is able to move down these slopes into these streams, and this is what's causing your pollution problems into the streams and eventually into somebody's pond or actually into the river. So that's why it's so important to put these water diversion devices in to keep this sediment out of the streams. Like I said, some of your remediation work after you're done may involve putting in hay bales, silt fencing, water bars, turnouts, all these to control any movement of sediment from roads, skid trails, interior roads into streams where they're going to cause pollution problems. And you see, as you can see in this slide, you have silt fencing, hay bales put in. It's a good idea to put down some hay, some grass seed. I tell people all the time, it's very, very inexpensive to use hay and grass seed to help stabilize some of these areas along with hay bales to make sure you have a good vegetative layer that keeps that sediment from moving into these streams. Here's another example of using hay and grass seed. It's in the bottom part of that slide. That's been hayed and grass seeded very well, along with the silt fencing to keep sediment from moving, into these low-lying areas. Here's some of your grass mats or enviro mats that can be used to put down those and put grass seed on top of those and help stabilize the soil surface. The biggest thing I'm trying to get across to everyone here is to stabilize these surfaces. If you see an area that is exposed and has a lot of bare soil visible, these areas need to be stabilized, especially where they're on a slope and they're going down into a streamside area, whether it's a perennial or intermittent stream. Make sure you stabilize these approaches or slopes going down into these streams. Where you have steep roads, make sure they're stabilized efficiently. All right, this is another part of our BMPs. One of the core areas is timber harvesting. It's a great idea to make sure that you plan or have a pre-harvest plan in place before you ever move on to the tract of timber that you're cutting. Make sure that you know where all your roads and landings will be located, what's going to need to be stabilized when completed, where your bad slopes are, probably where you need to put in some skid trails, where your crossings may be. Biggest thing is to minimize your rutting, compaction, and ponding, on these logging sites, especially where the loading deck is located. Make sure that you dispose of all the trash that is left. That's one of my biggest pet peeves is pulling up to a harvest track and noticing a bunch of bright yellow hydraulic buckets laying around everywhere. I promise you my inspection is going to get a lot more detailed if I see a lot of buckets laying around. And of course, this is one telltale sign of fuel spills. If I see a lot of hydraulic buckets, I know you had a hydraulic leak at one point in time during this operation. Whether it's minor or major, I'm going to find it, and that goes into protecting our streams from any pollutant getting in there. And ADM requires anything less than 25 gallons be treated on site and removed. If it's more than 25 gallons and you have a major spill, you need to contact ADM and let them know so that proper steps can be taken to remove these fluids. And number one, make sure they don't get into a waterway, a main creek or stream that can transport these into rivers and ponds. We want to stay away from logging or harvesting when it's very wet. I see this quite a bit with a lot of the complaints that I have. Excessive rutting. You know when it's too wet to not be logging. Stay away from the tracks and stay away from cutting and harvesting when the conditions are too wet. You can always go back to these tracks later, when conditions are drier. These problems like these slides right here, they're hard to fix, but they do need to be fixed because these can transport water into streams and carry sediment as well. So when it's too wet to log, so don't do it. Like I was talking about earlier with the hydraulic buckets, I hate to see this on logging jobs, and I will make a thorough inspection if I see a lot of hydraulic buckets laying around. It doesn't take long to load these in the back of your truck and take them with you. Not only the buckets, but the filters, the lunchtime trash, wrappers, cans, bottles. It's a good idea to have a on-site big trash can that you can just put all this stuff in, and when it's full, take it home with you, put it into a trash receptacle, and get it off that property. A lot of times I tell loggers that have these problems, you don't want people putting trash on your property, so why leave your trash on theirs? Just be considerate and of someone else's property and take this trash with you. Going on to fluid spills, and this happens on a lot of logging operations. You might have a hydraulic hose bust. It's a good idea to immediately shut that equipment down, replace that hose so that you limit the fluid spill on that property. If you know you've got a hose that's leaking, don't sit there and continue to run that skidder or run that cutter or loader. Go ahead and get that hose fixed where you don't leak fluid all over someone else's property. Like I said, just replace the hose. Don't quit bandaging up a problem that could be fixed properly. If you know you have a leak, go ahead and repair it. Another part, the main core of our state BMPs is reforestation. This takes into consideration your mechanical site prep, chemical site prep. Make sure this is done properly. On your mechanical site prep, make sure that this is done on a contour. You stay away from the SMZ areas. Make sure your machine planning is on the contour. If you're using herbicides or pesticides, make sure they're the right mixtures are applied. Do not overspray into your SMZ areas. Always check your weather conditions. Make sure it's not a real windy day if you're going to apply herbicides or pesticides, so that it drifts over into your SMZ areas and kills, the trees that you've taken all that time to leave. Make sure your fertilization is done properly. You don't want that nutrient flow into the streams, so you want to have a buffer of where you put your fertilizer, and make sure it is kept away from your SMZs. If you're putting in fire lanes, if you have slope, make sure you're still using fire breaks where you're putting your fire, excuse me, let me go back. Where you're putting in your fire lanes, make sure that you're using your water diversion devices, water bars, properly, to where if you're putting in fire lanes where there's a lot of slope involved, make sure that you have the proper water bars put in. So if you go back and you do some prescribed burning, you have to refresh some of these fire lanes or fire breaks, make sure these water bars are put back in. Here's an example of improper site prep. This was actually site prep good to begin with. Then the landowner decided he wanted to take his dozer back in and run his dozer up and down this slope and smooth it out a little bit better. Well, what he did was cause ruts, where he left his tracks going up and down this slope. And your first couple inches of rain with a significant rainfall is going to cause that sediment movement, down that slope, because there was no stabilization efforts put in at that time, and you got a major problem. All right, let's talk a little bit about conversions. Conversions are not covered by the Section 404 exception, with the exception that a landowner must get a permit. If you're converting a forested area to a residential or commercial area, of course you must contact ADM or Corps engineers and get the proper 404 permit for that conversion. If you're converting a wetland to an upland, you definitely need to get that permit. It's a good idea not to even attempt that to begin with. But if you're, all these upland conversions, you should get an MPDES permit from ADM. And you can read about this more in our Alabama Best Management Practices manual. It goes over all your Section 404 exemptions, when you need a permit and when you do not need a permit. All right, so switching gears a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about the state BMP complaints for the last 2 years. In fiscal year 2018, we had 39 total BMP complaints received. These complaints were either phony complaints sent from concerned landowners or complaints that were sent into ADM, which were forwarded to the Alabama Forestry Commission. There were 36 BMP complaints and 3 U.S. Army Corps of Engineer wetland complaints that were made in 2018. Out of these different complaints, there were 13 valid standard complaints. The 2 complaints involving wetlands were also valid. You had 2 ag conversions, and 22 of these total complaints were not valid. A lot of times that's just a disgruntled landowner, adjacent landowner that doesn't like the fact that his neighbor's cutting timber and calls in and makes a complaint. So we get a lot of those every year. Most BMP violations in 2018 were minor and quickly remediated. So it was fairly easy year in 2018. Not a whole lot of complaints. We started seeing a different trend in 2019. A few more complaints, 41 that were received. Of these, 15 were valid, 18 were not valid, and there were 8 conversions, which did not require AFC involvement. Most of the valid BMP violations in 2019 appeared that so folks were getting in a little bit of a hurry, getting too much in a hurry to finish the track they're cutting and move off, and not doing the remediation work that was involved to implement your BMPs, or just cutting too many corners. Or they could have just been totally negligent, and some of these were pretty atrocious. So when you finish your track, when you finish harvesting your track, make sure you, with your planning, go through all your BMP implementation procedures. What do we need to remediate? What kind of work do we need to do to close out the track before you leave and move on to the next track? Some of the reoccurring problems that we see on a lot of these timber harvests or timber operations are the roads not being stabilized. You know, if you've got a road on a steep slope, make sure you put your water bars in, your turnouts. Saw a lot of different roads that did not have any water bars, turnouts, anything. We're still seeing a lot of muddy ponds where you have improper SMZs and you have silt getting into these perennial and intermittent streams that go to your neighbor's pond. First thing they're going to do is call the ADM or the Forestry Commission and complain about their muddy pond. And before you know it, you have a lawsuit on your hands. So make sure with your planning that you protect these SMZs or streams by providing the proper streamside management zones. And if anything else, go above and beyond and make your SMZs wider. Still seeing a lot of fluid spills on some of these logging operations around the loading deck. So repair those hydraulic fittings, hoses, when they're leaking as soon as possible to make sure that you don't have a recurring leak. And you know, probably our biggest complaint involves stream crossings or creek crossings. And a lot of what I've seen in this past year are crossings that are put in using dirt, logging slash, debris, just packing it in and not removing it or improperly removing it and stabilizing those crossings. So just remember, as a rule of thumb, anything that you put in has to be pulled back out of the stream and those crossings stabilized. 2019, these are some of our numbers for our random closed out track inspection year. And I'll briefly go over that. Out of all of our counties, we have so many inspections that we have per county. And this is all dependent upon how much wood production is made by each county. Where you have, a lot of mills within counties or close to these different counties like Clark, Butler, Marengo, you're going to have a higher amount of inspections that should be done each year. Up in North Alabama, you might have one or two inspections per county that are done. But this is what we did last year. We were 98.7% implementation on harvesting, 97.5% on forest roads, 97.6% implementation on stream crossings, 98.3% implementation on SMZs. So all of you loggers out there, you're doing a great job. Keep up what you're doing. It seems like our BMP complaints are starting to get a little bit lower each year now. I know as of currently, we have 32 BMP complaints for this year. I expect, and this, our fiscal year runs out the end of September. So we're probably going to be around that mid-30s level. So they're starting to slowly go down, and that's because of you and because of what you do, attending these classes and learning more about BMPs and BMP implementation. You're taking this that you learn and taking it out into the field and using it. And I applaud you for that. And I appreciate all your hard work and what you're doing to help protect the BMPs. So keep it up, everyone. Everybody's doing a great job, especially when you can get 98.2% overall implementation rate for the year. So congratulations. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, I'll actually be on this call. I know this is kind of a weird way to do it. It beats anything I've ever seen, because I'd rather be in front of everyone and talking and cutting up and having a good time and making sure you know everything about BMPs. But we're not able to do that right now during these crazy times. So any questions, any concerns, here's my office number, my cell phone number, my email, any BMP material that you have that you need, you can contact our AFC site. But feel free to call me if you have any questions on logging jobs and you're not quite sure, about the BMPs, with what you need to do to finish out your BMP remediation work. Feel free to call me. That's my job. That's what I do best. I go out and give you advice on technical advice and on how to fix these issues or how to keep them from becoming problems. So please call me if you have any questions or concerns, when you're out there logging. And please, everyone, stay safe. Hopefully we'll be done with this COVID-19 stuff before long, and everybody can get out and, intermingle, and it'll get back to usual. But in the meantime, everybody stay safe and wear those masks when you need to, and hope the best for you and your families, and have a great day. Take care.